I never thought betrayal would come wearing a familiar face, a face I'd known since birth, the one I used to share secrets and giggles with late at night when we were kids, tucked under blankets and whispering so our parents wouldn't hear. But sometimes the cruelest cuts don't come from strangers. They come from the people you'd have taken a bullet for. And mine came from my own sister. I'll never forget the day I found out. It started like any other, ordinary, boring even. I woke up in the morning to the smell of coffee, kissed my fiancé, and went about my routine thinking I had a future I could count on. Weddings, a home, maybe kids down the line. You know, all those milestones you dream about when you believe you found the right person. I was blind, or maybe just naive, because I didn't see it coming. Not from him, and especially not from her. You ever get that gut punch of truth that leaves you gasping like the air has been ripped out of your lungs? That was me, standing in the middle of my apartment when a mutual friend let it slip. They didn't mean to, I could tell. It was one of those awkward accidents where a half sentence gives everything away. Oh, did he tell you about what happened with your sister that night? And then silence, their eyes wide, realizing too late what they'd just said. My ears were ringing. My hands went cold, and I remember just standing there, staring, waiting for them to say something that would make it make sense, something that would take it back. But no, there was no misunderstanding, no joke gone wrong. Piece by piece, the truth came out, and I was left there, numb, while my so-called friend stumbled over apologies. I went home that night and confronted him. He didn't even try to deny it. That broke me more than anything. The fact that he just sat there, head in his hands, and admitted it. Admitted that yes, he had slept with my sister, the love of my life, and the girl I had shared a childhood with, sneaking my clothes and laughing over inside jokes. Together, behind my back. I can't even put into words the kind of devastation that brings. It's not just heartbreak. It's like someone's reached inside your chest and pulled out everything you thought you knew about loyalty, love, and trust, and then set it on fire right in front of you. I remember screaming, crying, pacing, throwing things across the room because I didn't know what else to do with the rage boiling in my blood. And her, God, my sister. When I called her, she didn't even sound sorry. She tried to twist it, telling me it just happened, like she'd tripped and fallen into his bed. She told me she didn't mean to hurt me, as if intention mattered. I could hear the edge in her voice too, like she was annoyed I'd found out. That hurt even more than the betrayal itself. Do you know what it's like to lose two people at once? To feel your future crumble while your past betrays you too? I didn't just lose a fiancé that day. I lost my sister, my best friend, the person I thought would stand by me for life. My family was furious. They were just as blindsided as I was. My mom sobbed, my dad slammed his fists on the table, and in a way, I could see their heartbreak mirrored in theirs. Because when one child hurts another, it doesn't just cut the sibling, it splits the whole family down the middle. They made their choice, though. They stood by me. They told her she wasn't welcome anymore, that she had crossed a line you don't come back from, and they cut her off. For a while, that was the only thing that gave me any sense of justice, that my family saw what she had done and didn't excuse it. She wasn't invited to holidays, her number was blocked, my mom refused to even say her name. She was gone, exiled, and I thought maybe that was enough. Maybe distance would dull the wound. But you don't just bounce back from that kind of betrayal. You try, sure. I tried therapy, I tried keeping busy, throwing myself into work. My fiancé and I attempted to patch things up, but let's be honest,
how do you rebuild trust when the foundation has been completely obliterated? I would look at him and see her. I would hear him say he loved me, and all I could think about was how he'd said those same words before, sneaking off to her bed. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I ended it, packed up the ring, the plans, the dreams, and shoved them into a box I couldn't bear to open. The years that followed were empty. That's the only word for it. You know that dull ache you carry around after something shatters your world? Like a shadow that never leaves? That was me. I learned to live with it, to laugh again, to build a life that didn't revolve around pain. But I never forgot. Not really. And then, out of nowhere, years later, she came crawling back. I almost didn't recognize her. She looked smaller somehow, broken in ways I hadn't imagined. Life hadn't been kind to her. She'd lost her job, her friends, her home. She was alone, and she wanted forgiveness. She begged me, literally begged to let her back into my life. Imagine being in my shoes. What would you have done? Would you have slammed the door right then and there, told her to rot in the mess she made? Or would you have let her back in? Because blood is blood, and somewhere beneath the betrayal, there's still that little girl you used to build blanket forts with. I'll be honest, I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to watch her squirm, to revel in the justice of karma catching up to her, but another part of me, the darker part, felt something I hadn't expected. Satisfaction. Because for the first time, she was the one holding power over me. For the first time, she was the one begging. You ever feel that flicker inside you? That little voice whispering, "This is your chance." I felt it that night, stronger than ever. For years, I'd been the victim, the one left behind in ruins while she lived her life without consequence. But now I had the upper hand. She asked if I could help her, just until she got back on her feet, maybe a place to stay, maybe help finding work. And I smiled. God, I actually smiled because I realized this was it. This was the beginning. What would you have done? Be honest. Would you have slammed the door right then and there, told her to rot in the mess she made? Or would you have done what I did? Pulled her in closer, not out of love, but out of strategy. Because here's the thing about revenge. It's not about striking when the wound is fresh. No, real revenge is patient. It waits. It studies. It finds the perfect moment to dig the knife in deep. And I had waited years already. What were a few more months, maybe a year, if it meant she'd finally feel what I had felt? So I told her yes. I told her we could rebuild, that forgiveness was possible, that maybe we could find our way back. She cried, thanked me, hugged me like she used to when we were kids, and I hugged her back, my smile hidden in her shoulder, knowing she had no idea what I was planning. Because forgiveness might have been the right thing to do, but revenge was the only thing that would make me whole again. The thing about a plan is that it looks a lot like ordinary life when you're in the middle of it. Nobody notices the scaffolding if it's built slowly enough. Friends call it patience, co-workers call it being level-headed, and your sister, the very person you were building the scaffolding for, called it a second chance. She never saw the blueprints. She never saw the small, careful things I was doing every day to make sure that when the moment came, everything would fall exactly the way I wanted it to. That was the cruel genius of it. Revenge that looked like mercy.
At first, the plan was little more than quiet observation. I let her stay because she begged, and because, God help me, being the one who forgives felt sometimes like a relief. Not really for her, for me. To have the power to say yes felt strangely intoxicating after years of feeling powerless. I watched her like a scientist studies a specimen. I learned how she slept, when she panicked, what made her laugh, what made her defensive. I listened to her tell the same warped versions of events, the same half apologies that always seemed to leave out the worst parts. She'd say, "It just happened. I was lonely. I didn't mean to hurt you," like a broken record. And I'd nod and hand her a cup of coffee and let her talk until she'd tired herself out and fallen asleep on my couch like a child. I made myself small in the early days, the sister who was willing to help. I fixed holes in her resume, I taught her how to budget, and I let her borrow clothes. My family saw it and called me naive, even as they praised my generosity. But they didn't see the way I cataloged everything. I kept notes in my head like one of those detectives in TV dramas, small things that would matter later. Who she called first when she needed money, who she lied to when she tried to cover up a debt, how fast she would panic when I suggested looking for work in a certain part of town. Every tell was a piece of the puzzle. I think the turning point for me was when she started getting comfortable again. That was the scariest part. People who have nothing cling to the ropes they find, but once those ropes become comfortable swings, they forget how they got back up. She began to smile again. She started dressing in clothes that fit, not just the worn-out things she'd arrived in. She even flirted a little, the old ease returning to her like a muscle memory. It should have made me angry. Why should she reclaim joy when she'd taken years of it for me? But instead, it made me precise. Because joy without consequence is a luxury. And I planned to make sure she paid for every night I spent on the bathroom floor sobbing over a future that was stolen. You think revenge is all fireworks and dramatic confrontations? In truth, most of it lives in the banal. A plan, like a relationship, has milestones. Mine began with credibility. If she was going to rebuild her life and live openly among us again, she needed proof that she had changed. That meant a job, steady pay, and the appearance of stability. So I helped her with those things, but always on my terms. I recommended employers where I knew people in the hiring chain, but I didn't pull strings. I made sure her resume was solid, but not perfect. I pushed her toward jobs that required honesty and responsibility. Jobs where a record of being flaky would show up, where renting an apartment would require references. I helped, but with gentle nudges that would force her to walk through doors I had already unlocked. And while I was giving her these little ladders, I kept a parallel trail of breadcrumbs for myself, evidence, something you can't come back from if it's presented in the right way. I trained myself to notice the inconsistencies in her stories, to take screenshots of messages she bragged about then deleted, to keep copies of receipts she said she lost. People who live on impulse and charm rarely think about documentation. I made sure I did. I photocopied letters she claimed were lost. I took photos of the car she drove when she said she was walking. I archived the petty lies she told at holiday dinners and the major ones she muttered in the dark. I built a dossier the way lawyers build a case, patiently, methodically, with an eye for what would sting the most. This next part is where it gets delicate, where you have to decide how public you want the punishment to be. I knew I could ruin her quietly, cut her off again, make sure she was alone and broke, but that wouldn't be satisfying in the way I wanted. It wouldn't make the point. I wanted everyone who had watched me suffer to understand why I had been hurt, and I wanted the people who had once enabled her to remember the choices they made. So I decided on a mixture of humiliation and exposure, not savage for the sake of savagery, but surgical. She would lose exactly what she had taken from me: reputation, comfort, and the easy sympathy of our shared social circle. There are risks in staging a comeback so you can wreck it later.
The biggest risk is that you let the person back into your life and they actually change. People can surprise you. My sister had remnants of decency in her. There were nights she sat across from me at the kitchen table and looked genuinely remorseful, and I'd feel my plan wobble. You think you want them to feel pain, but then you catch a glimpse of their humanity, and the choice to hurt them becomes a moral maze. I wrestled with that every night. Wake up, reframe, recommit. The line between justice and cruelty is a narrow one, and I walked it over and over. There were practical obstacles, too. She had friends who were still loyal, some because they'd never been hurt by her, others because they stood to gain something. That meant I had to be secretive about certain moves. You can't build a case and also tell everyone you're building a case. I pretended to be the supportive sister in public and the archivist in private. I met with old friends she'd wronged under the guise of hosting a get-together. At those meetings, I listened more than I talked. The more I listened, the more I learned. There were stories I hadn't known, little betrayals she'd committed, favors she'd promised and never returned, manipulations that she'd used to get out of responsibility. It painted a fuller picture and hardened my resolution. One night, after months of this careful choreography, she made a misstep that opened the door wider than I'd planned. She was reckless, the way people are when they become complacent. She confided in a new friend, someone she thought was harmless, about a financial problem she had, and the friend recorded it. Not in a mean way, but in the casual, let's remember this way people sometimes do with voice memos. The friend, perhaps naive or perhaps spiteful, showed me the recording. It was little, a voice saying, "I might need to ask my family for money. I don't want them to know how much I spent." But to me, it was gold. To hear her plot her next move in her own voice after years of pretending to be contrite felt like a confession. It validated every scrap of paperwork I'd been collecting. That was the first time I realized I could orchestrate not just exposure, but timing. If I could show the right people the right evidence at the right moment, the consequences would cascade. Imagine a list of dominoes you can set up at various houses in different cities. Knock the first one down in the right way, and the rest follow. So I started to plan the hits like a chess player, thinking 3 moves ahead. Which family member would react most strongly to this specific proof? Which cousin would share it out of moral outrage? Who would be the weak link? The person who'd say something in the wrong place at the wrong time? That was the art of it. And then, of course, you have to orchestrate perception. Let me be blunt. If people think someone is truly redeemed, you won't get far showing them the ugliness. You needed to make sure the community saw her as restored before you revealed the lie. So I nudged things in public to give her a glossy resurrection. I recommended a church group she could join for their charity events. I mentioned her as a success story in casual conversations with parents at school and with colleagues at the office. Nothing grand, just enough seeing eye endorsements that painted a picture. People like to believe in redemption almost as much as they like to revel in scandal. If she looks like she'd made things right, the fall would be sharper. There were nights I barely slept. I'd lie awake constructing scenarios that would lead to the maximum emotional damage with the least collateral pain to others who didn't deserve it. I'm not proud of the calculus, but you have to be precise when you want to hurt someone in a way that is indelible. You don't just shout and hope. You engineer. A close call almost ruined everything. She'd gotten a part-time job at a boutique downtown, the kind of place where everyone talks and stories spread like wildfire. One evening, I went in accident, to buy a gift. I saw her talking to a woman who had once been one of my closest friends. The friend had been emotionally messy the night my engagement fell apart, and I'd cut her slack then, because, well, we all have lapses. Seeing the two of them together, smiling, felt like watching actors rehearse for the very scene that would destroy me later. But then something happened that made my heart drop. They hugged me in front of my sister. My pulse raced. If they had hugged me and said the wrong thing, if they had mentioned in public how, "We're so glad she's back," it would undo the careful distance I'd cultivated. I kept my face neutral, bought the gift, and left. Later, when I replayed that moment in my head, I told myself it was a reminder that the path I'd chosen could blow up at any time. I tightened my plan, adding contingencies in case allies of hers.
You learn to read the room, to anticipate human generosity, and to use it. Because you will always have to reckon with other people who are kind, who want to believe someone can change. They are the reason you have to be cold-blooded in your timing. Meanwhile, my sister, unaware of my internal symphony, started to talk openly about the past, but only in sanitized versions that made her seem remorseful. "I've learned so much," she said at dinners. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize how much pain I caused." She was playing a role better than some actors I'd seen on TV. People forgave her with the same weary grace they give to celebrities returning from scandal. My parents, bless them, softened too. My mother would send her text messages that sounded like they were written by someone hoping to mend fences. The family started to open around her like a bud slowly unfurling. I watched it all with a stomach that tightened into knots. One morning, an event shifted everything. My father suffered a minor health scare. Nothing dramatic, just enough to strain the family finances because of the bills and because our insurance had loopholes. Suddenly, old resentments became secondary to practical needs. My sister, who had worked odd shifts in retail and had little savings, went into overdrive, saying she could help cover expenses. She offered to host a fundraiser, to reach out to her network, to run errands. She wanted to prove she could be useful. My mother welcomed it. My father, still fragile, was pleased. People were so eager for good news that they overlooked the fact that this was the same person who'd once fractured our family. Or maybe they were willing to overlook it because the temptation to be whole again is stronger than caution. This is where the moral complexity accelerates. I saw the temptation to let her help. Who doesn't want extra hands when a parent is sick? And for a minute, I felt torn. If I exposed her now, when the family needed support, I would risk looking like a monster. But if I waited until after they were safe, I risked losing the chance I'd worked so hard to create. My revenge had to be impeccable. It had to land when it mattered, when the betrayal could be contrasted against her supposed good deeds. I made the agonizing choice to let her take the reins of the fundraiser, to be the hero for a weekend, while I continued to collect the pieces that would destroy her. The fundraiser was a masterclass in illusion. She organized bake sales, used social media to drum up support, and posted pictures of the family at the hospital with captions about unity and healing. People responded. Neighbors who had been distant started to share posts, donate little amounts, and praise her for stepping up. Her smile in those pictures was the same one she'd used when she wanted sympathy after the initial scandal. I watched the likes roll in and felt two opposing tides: the warm pride of seeing people come together for my father, and the cold calculation of watching a performance that would soon unravel spectacularly. Then came the crack. One of the donation receipts, an innocuous thing, a printed slip from a local coffee shop where she'd claimed a large donation had been purchased as part of a silent auction, didn't add up. I saw it by chance when a mutual friend sent me a message asking if I could confirm the donor. The name on the receipt matched a man who'd been one of her ex-lovers, someone who'd left town suddenly several years back under a cloud. I'd seen this man at a dinner once and heard him laugh with her in a way that made my skin crawl.
He had judged her and enabled her behavior before. When I confronted the friend about the mismatch, she offhandedly told me, "She keeps saying she's using her connections, but some of us are skeptical." That was all I needed. I started to pull at the thread. A phone call here, an email there. I cross-checked donors, followed receipts, and discovered a pattern of small fabrications. A staged donor who had given nothing, a pretend auction item that had never existed, a pledge that had been promised and never fulfilled. None of it was massive on its face. It was the mosaic of deceit that mattered. The more I found, the more confident I became that she was using the fundraiser not to help, but to create the appearance of redemption. To me, that was unforgivable in the context of our past. But evidence is only half the battle. How you present it is the other half. I thought about going to the family with what I had, about pulling up records and saying, "Look, she's doing this." But I wanted the moment to be more public, a place where she couldn't hide behind tears and denials. I wanted the community, the people who'd applauded her posts and donated because they wanted to help, to feel the betrayal too. That way, her fall wouldn't just be personal, it would be social, irreversible. So I mapped a new move. I would compile the discrepancies into a format that seemed irrefutable. I wrote down the donor names, matched them to bank records, and saved screenshots of her posts that promised one thing and delivered another. I contacted a former coworker who had a background in event management and asked her if she would look over the paperwork for me. Comfortably anonymous, someone impartial who could attest to the oddities. She agreed. That was the scent of legitimacy I needed. If an outsider said, "This doesn't compute," it would be harder for my family to dismiss me as bitter. The days leading up to the confrontation were the worst. You know that feeling when you have a plan and every little thing becomes a possible landmine? I replayed conversations in my head with surgical precision. I thought about whether to record the confrontation. I rehearsed the words I would use so not to sound hysterical, because credibility is a fragile thing in family disputes. I couldn't let my emotions be used against me. I had to be the woman who delivered facts. And then, still one more complication, my sister improved. She scheduled doctor's visits for my father. She took inventory of meds. She coordinated rides for hospital appointments. People praised her outside of the home, thanking her for stepping up. It was suffocating. I asked myself, in the dead of night, whether hurting her publicly while she was helping my father would make me monstrous. But I kept circling back to the idea that if she used charity and sympathy as a mask, she should not be allowed to profit from it emotionally or socially. If the cost of exposing her was temporary pain for the family, I weighed that against the long-term cost of allowing her to continue the charade and infect our lives with fake apologies for the rest of our days. The night I decided to act felt like slipping off a cliff. I printed the evidence and arranged it in a chronology. For weeks, my little notebook had felt like a weapon, but also like a confession. It now looked clinical, neat, and impossible to argue with. I planned to bring it to my mother mid-afternoon, when the house would be quiet and the fundraiser conversation more likely to come up. I wanted my mom to ask, "How is she using the funds?" and to be ready to point to the paper that said, "She isn't." I rehearsed tone, I practiced restraint, and then, in a twist that even I didn't expect, I felt a flash of pity. For a second, I imagined the scene turning into one of those family healing montages, where the truth leads to tears and then to reconciliation. I shook myself out of it like a bad dream. Not now, I told myself. Not yet. I arrived at my mother's house with the stack of papers in my bag and the hard part inside me, resolve. My mom met me with a tired hug and asked me about mundane things, the weather, work, the cat, small talk. Then she said, "Your sister really has been so helpful, hasn't she? I feel better knowing she's around." And I felt the old anger like a live wire. "This isn't right," I said, and I laid the papers out. The look on my mother's face is something I still think about. It was not the immediate betrayal I envisioned, where eyes widened and jaws dropped. Instead, there was a strange stillness, like a boat pausing on a calm sea. She read, slowly, the way you read a letter you don't want to believe. Then she said the first words that really mattered. "Are you sure?" I had the answer ready. "I triple-checked it," I said. "I had someone look at it. It doesn't make sense." She called my sister into the living room as if it was a simple conversation, and the house filled with the smell of tea. When my sister stepped in, she looked like a woman expecting to be given more praise. My mother put the papers in front of her and asked, "Can you explain these discrepancies?" The room tightened. She started to babble. At first, the same rehearsed apologies. But as my mother read through line after line, the voice that had charmed people for years began to splinter. The first denials came, then hesitation, then a tear that was predictably timed, and finally an admission that was more like a confession between a penitent and a priest. "I made mistakes," she said. "I borrowed, I promised, I didn't deliver." Her voice cracked. And then the quiet, cruel part of the evening arrived. My
Mother's face collapsed into something I'd never seen before. Betrayal in the rawest sense. There was a long, thick pause as the family recalibrated. My sister's eyes found mine across the table, and for a heartbeat, we returned to those tiny girls, building forts under blankets. Then it snapped away, like a film being cut. The person I had once loved looked small and ridiculous and exposed all at once. My mother's hands trembled as she reached for the phone to call someone. An accountant, a lawyer, anyone who might make the abstract facts into real consequences. That is when I understood the final, terrible beauty of what I had done. It wasn't just that I had exposed my sister, it was that I had done it in a way that left no simple escape. People often imagine revenge as a single moment of triumph, a shouted line and a dramatic exit. But the moment that night was quieter and more devastating. It wasn't the climax I'd fantasized about, it was the beginning of the end. The dominoes I'd placed, friends who'd supported her, receipts that didn't match, the fundraiser that had been a staged performance began to fall, not with a bang, but with the small, insistent sound of consequences waking up. Family members called other family members. Someone texted a screenshot. Conversations that had once been warm turned transactional. My sister, who had once walked in lights and charm, was now walking on glass. She collapsed in the doorway on her way out, as if she had expected the floor to be soft. She said, "I'm so sorry," again, the words having lost meaning with every repetition. I watched her leave, her shoulders rounding in on themselves, and I felt something that was both satisfaction and a terrible emptiness. The thing I had wanted, her humiliation, her removal from the comfortable life she'd tried to rebuild, had begun. But so had a new reality in which I was responsible for the fallout. Family dinners would be awkward. My father's recovery might be slowed by stress. I had lit a fire that would warm no one and scorch many. As she walked away into the gray evening, clutching a small bag with the few things she'd brought back into our lives, I let myself for the first time in months imagine the final scene. Not a movie finish, but a quiet settling. People remembering me not as the woman who let herself be wronged, but as the one who had held her ground. The revenge wasn't a victory dance. It was a delicate, surgical undoing of the lie she had built. I had given her the performance she craved, and then shown the world the script behind it. There were consequences I hadn't fully accounted for. The looks from neighbors at church, the hesitant glances at family events, and the fact that some people would never forgive me for what they saw as cruelty.
but I'd rather be seen as cruel than live forever with the wound she had carved into my life. That was the rationalization I used to sleep sometimes. If you're listening to this and you're asking, was it worth it? That question followed me like a shadow. In the immediate aftermath, it felt like breathing again after being underwater. My chest unknotted a little. Friends who had watched me crumble called and said, "Finally." Strangers who'd only known her one side were shocked, and there was a grim satisfaction in seeing polite smiles drop away. But I also learned that revenge is not closure, it's punctuation. The sentence ends, but the paragraph continues. You still wake up with echoes. You still go to work. You still call your mother and ask about the cat. Life resumes its ordinary cruelty alongside the extraordinary one you engineered. For now, the plan had worked up to a point. She was exposed. She had lost the fragile canopy of goodwill she'd built. But the story was far from over. There would be lawyers and explanations and the hard work of making sure the misused funds were returned. There would be angry people who came in her defense. And there would be nights when I heard her voice in my dreams, asking me to come back, to be the sister I used to be. The temptation to feel triumphant was real, but I had learned the hard way that triumph in this kind of war is temporary. The real test was what came next. The slow, grinding process of watching whether those dominoes I'd toppled would stay down, and whether my own heart could handle the aftermath without breaking further. I drove home that night with the papers folded in the glove compartment like a talisman. The streetlights passed over my hands, and the car hummed like a heart that didn't know what to do with the new rhythm. I had set matters in motion, and the next act would be played out by others now. By my family, by the community, by the legal system maybe. I was no longer the only actor on the stage. But the center of the drama had shifted, and that, at least, felt like a beginning. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have exposed her, or would you have swallowed the betrayal to keep the family whole? Be honest, would you have waited this long for payback? I think about that question more than I'd like to admit, especially in the quiet hours when the house is still and the roar of what I did seems unbearably loud. In the days that followed, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Calls, texts, whispers drifting in from every corner of the family tree. You know how gossip spreads, like smoke in a dry forest. Once it catches, there's no stopping it. The fundraiser discrepancies had broken the dam, and people were desperate to talk about it. Some wanted details, some wanted explanations, and some just wanted to tell me they always had a bad feeling about her, as if hindsight was some badge of wisdom. My mother, poor thing, was caught in the middle. She tried to keep the conversations measured, tried to soften the edges of what was quickly becoming an all-out scandal, but it was impossible. People were angry, not just at my sister, but at themselves for believing in her again. And when people get angry at themselves, they tend to deflect it onto someone else. Some aimed it at me, muttering that I could have handled it quietly without dragging things out into the open. But I knew better. Quiet doesn't teach lessons. Quiet doesn't dismantle the illusions. Quiet lets people crawl back, and I wasn't about to let that happen a second time. My father, still recovering from his health scare, had the hardest time processing it. He looked so tired, like the weight of betrayal sat heavier on him than the illness ever could. I remember one evening, sitting by his bed, when he asked me, "Why would she do this to us again?" And I didn't have an answer. I don't think there is one that makes sense. People like her don't think in the same way. We measure consequences, they measure opportunities. To her, every situation is a chance to get something, no matter who it hurts. Meanwhile, my sister vanished. She didn't answer calls, didn't show her face at work, didn't update her social media. She disappeared into the shadows like a fugitive. And part of me wondered if I'd finally broken her. For a while, I thought maybe that was enough. Maybe the humiliation, the exposure, the rejection from the family and community would settle the score. But then that nagging voice inside me, the one that had guided me all these years, kept whispering, "But is it really enough? Does she really understand what she did to you? Or does she just regret being caught?" Because regret and remorse are not the same thing. Regret is about consequences. Remorse is about empathy. And I knew my sister well enough to know she didn't feel remorse. She felt regret for losing the cushioned life she was trying to rebuild. She felt regret that the mask had slipped, but she didn't feel what I had felt. The nights of sobbing into my pillow, the mornings where I woke up and forgot for a split second that my fiancé and my sister had destroyed my future, only to remember and feel the knife twist all over again. She hadn't lived that. She hadn't bled like I bled. And until she did, until she knew the true depth of that pain, part of me would never be satisfied. And here's where things got complicated because people started to forgive her anyway. Can you believe that? Some cousins whispered that she was going through a hard time. A few old friends told me maybe I should let it go now that the truth was out. One even said, "You've won. Isn't that enough?" And I wanted to scream. Enough? Was it enough when I had to watch my dreams of marriage collapse? Was it enough when I lost both my partner and my sister in one brutal blow? Was it enough when she strutted back years later acting like a victim, begging me for forgiveness only to manipulate everyone again? No, it wasn't enough. But you can't say that out loud without sounding bitter, without sounding like you're the villain in your own story. So I stayed quiet, smiled when people told me to move on, and nodded when they said time heals all wounds. Meanwhile, I was already thinking about the next step, because here's the truth about revenge. Once you taste it, once you see the first domino fall exactly the way you planned, it's intoxicating. It's not about cruelty. It's about balance. It's about finally being the one in control after years of being powerless. And I realized I wasn't ready to let that go. So when she resurfaced weeks later,
When she came slinking back, tail between her legs, trying to explain away the fundraiser fiasco with excuses about mismanagement and bad communication, I didn't shut her down. No, I let her talk. I let her spin her little story about how she never meant for things to get so messy, about how she just wanted to help, about how people were blowing things out of proportion. She looked at me with those wide eyes as if daring me to believe her. And I smiled, nodded, and offered her a cup of tea. Inside, though, my mind was racing. Because I knew the community's trust was gone. The family's patience was thin, and her options were dwindling. She was cornered, fragile, and desperate. And a desperate person is easier to push exactly where you want them to go. So I began to set the stage for the final act. I made lists the way I always did. Names, timelines, weak links, emotional triggers. But this time, the target wasn't only her public persona. It was every small, private thing that supported that persona. The people she leaned on, the lies she told herself, the half-truths that let her sleep at night. I wanted to make sure that when it all fell, she couldn't rebuild the house of cards. And because life is messy and unpredictable, I built in fail-safes, little redundancies that would catch me if one thread snapped. Revenge isn't glamorous. It's bookkeeping and endurance and, sometimes, a terrible loneliness. The first phase was financial. If she'd used the fundraiser to create the illusion of goodwill, then money would be the cleanest way to demonstrate the lie. I quietly contacted the charity that had been listed as a beneficiary and asked for a breakdown of donations. I did it as a concerned community member, nothing more. They sent me a polite, automated reply with totals and donor lists that didn't match the glossy numbers she'd posted. It wasn't earth-shattering on its own, but it added a layer. Every small inconsistency matters when you're building a case. Next, I turned to relationships, people she had leaned on for support. The ex-lovers, the friends she used as moral cover, the colleagues who had signed off on receipts without looking. I reached out to them in the same casual way I had always had before the betrayal, asking for coffee, asking for help locating something she'd said she had lost. People lower their guard when you ask what seems ordinary. One by one, they told me stories that fit like puzzle pieces. There was a credit card she'd opened in someone else's name, a small business that was listed as a sponsor, but had never actually donated, a pattern of borrowing and not returning that had become a lifestyle. It was like watching a map of her choices light up in places I'd suspected all along. I should say that I was careful to avoid anything illegal. I compiled public records, receipts, screenshots, testimonies, things that would stand up if someone wanted to dispute them. I wanted this to be indelible, not rumor. You'd be surprised how few people keep meticulous records of other people's wrongs. I kept everything. Maybe it was cowardly, maybe it was prudent. Either way, the pile of evidence grew until it felt heavy in my bag and in my chest. Meanwhile, I kept being the sister. Publicly, I fed the narrative of reconciliation. I brought casseroles to my parents' house. I called to ask whether my father needed anything. I sat between her and our mother at a family lunch and listened to her talk about small, banal things like weather and television. I feigned normalcy so well that people around us started to soften again. That was the cruel irony. The better I pretended, the more convincing her act became. And the more convincing her act became, the more delicious the collapse would be when it happened. The second phase focused on her employment. She'd landed a managerial position at a local store after the fundraiser scandal, which was remarkable because she'd always been flaky in jobs that required follow-through. But she'd spun a convincing narrative about lessons learned and maturity gained, and the store had given her a chance. I targeted the store's corporate office with the precision of someone filing complaints. Not because I wanted her fired for the sake of a headline, though that would be a consequence, but because employment creates references, direct deposit accounts, and a paper trail that could reveal more inconsistencies if they existed. I posed as a customer with specific billing questions, as someone with a concern about a missing donation item that had supposedly been auctioned, and I recorded responses where they were given freely. Again, nothing illegal, just careful, patient recording of facts as they were offered. The third phase was psychological, and perhaps the cruelest. I wanted her to feel small in ways that mirrored the years I had felt small after she betrayed me. So I started to erode the narratives that supported her identity. She was always the person people called charismatic in my family, able to turn a crowd with a laugh, able to charm a neighbor into lending a tool. Charisma is a brittle shell. Take away the props and the attention, and the person inside either reveals themselves or crumbles. I orchestrated situations where she would be placed under the microscope. Group gatherings where innocuous questions would be asked and follow-ups would be prodded. Volunteer events where accountability for tasks would be public. I made sure that every time she claimed responsibility,
someone in the room had a paper trail to contradict her. You might call it petty. You might call it poetic. I called it necessary. People who exploit trust get comfortable with lies because no one asks the hard questions. I decided to be the one who asked. There were close calls, of course. Once, a curious cousin, one of those people who loves a mystery, started to piece together what I was doing. She confronted me gently, at a wedding, fingers wrapped around a champagne flute, and asked, "Why are you asking so many questions about past donations? What are you trying to prove?" My pulse spiked. In that instant, I realized that all of my careful planning could be exposed by a single, well-meaning gossip. I could have lied, laughed it off, and said I was just interested. But I didn't. I told her because I want to make sure the family knows the truth. Her face softened, and she said something that has stayed with me. Be careful what you wish for. It felt like a warning and a benediction all at once. Another time, my sister nearly tripped me up herself. She began a tentative relationship with someone new, a man who seemed solid and interested in her. I watched them from across the room at a picnic, their hands touching, their smiles private. For a fleeting, stupid second, I imagined walking over and making a scene. But I didn't. This plan wasn't about petty jealousy. It was about justice. Taking away her ability to manipulate meant taking away everything she relied upon. If she found someone genuinely kind, that would complicate everything. And so I watched as she brought him into family spaces, as she introduced him to the same people whose eyes had once been full of doubt. I cataloged their public statements and photographed the way their lives overlapped, always looking for anomalies that could be used to expose the pattern of her choices. There's a point in any long game where you must decide whether to escalate or to step back. I was addicted to the momentum. Each discovery fueled the next, and my list of fractures grew until it looked like a long, jagged skyline. But momentum can make you reckless. One night, drunk on the thrill of progress, I nearly sent an anonymous package to my sister, a bundle of printed receipts, screenshots, and a note that said simply, "Remember when you begged for a bed to sleep in?" It would have been a gut punch. It would have been cruel in a way that left no room for repair. I deleted the draft. Something snapped inside me that night. Maybe pity, or maybe a recognition of how far I'd already gone. I didn't want to be the sort of monster that revels purely in
pain. I wanted the consequences to be proportionate, to be surgical in the way the earlier phases had been. The plan moved toward its culminating scene the way a river moves toward the sea, inevitably. I had compiled enough that I could, if I wanted, take her down within a week. But again, timing was everything. The fallout needed to land when it would be most painful, when her network was thickest, when people had the most to lose by believing her, when her own pride made denial impossible. I circled my calendar inward, like a hawk narrowing in on prey. The moment presented itself one gray November afternoon. It began with a seemingly ordinary call from the charity. They told me they were auditing their accounts because an anonymous donor had written to say a promised donation hadn't shown up. I feigned surprise and concern and asked whether I could help coordinate communication. They sent me a spreadsheet. My hands trembled as I opened it. The numbers lined up with the patterns I had been tracking, the phantom pledges, the computer entries with mismatched reference numbers, the names of supposed sponsors that didn't match bank transfers. I called my old coworker, the event manager, and said, "It's time."
What followed was a surgical release of information that I had rehearsed 1,000 times in my head. We didn't make accusations without proof. We sent carefully worded emails to key people, my parents, a couple of cousins who were community influencers, the head of the charity, detailing discrepancies and offering to meet in person to go over the evidence. The goal was not to humiliate in a loud public way, but to ensure that the people whose trust she relied upon would see the full pattern. It was a precision strike. It's astonishing how quickly credibility disintegrates once people start to read facts that contradict what they believed. The meeting I requested with the charity and several family members was the arena. I brought my file and watched as rows of receipts and screenshots were spread across the kitchen table like an indictment. My mother's hands shook as she touched them. My sister sat across from me, hair tucked behind her ear, looking at the papers like they were foreign objects. At first, she tried the old tricks, the sighs, the half apologies, the story about miscommunication. But when the charity representative detailed the missing funds and the bank confirmed the lack of transfers, her excuse withered. The people watching her were not sympathetic critics anymore. They were investigators, and they were appalled. I remember the exact moment it became irretrievable. My sister reached for a printed receipt, a small ledger page that showed a promised amount and a donor name. She said, "But this person is a friend. He promised and he hasn't paid yet." A voice from the charity, steady and unimpressed, said, "We have no record of that person ever pledging." Her mouth opened. For the first time in years, I watched her not have a script. It was like seeing a magician fail to pull a rabbit from an empty hat. The fallout this time was faster and harder than before. People who had given her the benefit of the doubt took a different tack. They guarded themselves. Friends texted me privately, admitting they'd suspected things, but had been too embarrassed to check. Coworkers at the store where she worked started asking HR questions. The new boyfriend stopped returning calls. It was as if, in exposing one lie, I let loose a swarm that devoured everything she'd woven. Within days, the store had placed her on leave, pending an internal audit. People who thought they might be implicated began distancing themselves almost immediately. And yet, even then, there were moments that made my stomach turn. I overheard a neighbor say to another, "She's been through so much, maybe we should forgive and help her." To that, I felt a familiar pull of doubt and the rising ache of guilt. Was I doing harm beyond what she deserved? Was my pursuit of retribution pushing her toward an irreparable fall? There were nights I would drive around and park where I could watch her apartment building from a distance, not to spy on her per se, but because I wanted to see if she was okay. In the window one night, I saw her silhouette hunched over, her shoulders shaking. The feeling that rose then was complex. Satisfaction braided with sorrow, victory threaded with the knowledge that I had helped her make her small. But if you think for 1 second that the story ended with her being escorted out of the store or with prayers from neighbors, you don't know how lives unravel. Losing a job is a surface consequence. The deeper damage is trust withdrawn in a more fundamental sense. The calls that don't come, the invitations that stop, the implicit exclusion from the circles that once offered shelter. She would now have to explain herself to landlords, to potential employers, to people who once thought they knew her. That is not a simple thing to recover from. It requires humility and a sustained grind of proving reliability over months, sometimes years. I had taken away her shortcut: perform remorse, get sympathy, move on. Now she would have to rebuild without shortcuts. I could have stepped back then. I could have let the slow churn of consequences do the work and moved on with my life. But a stubborn, petty part of me wanted one more thing: an acknowledgement. Not just a public fall, but an admission that reached into the marrow. I wanted her to know, in words that couldn't be dismissed, exactly what she had done and the human cost of it. I wanted her to face the woman she had broken. So I arranged another meeting. This time, it was just the two of us in my apartment, the same couch where she had once cried and where I had once listened with a smile. I made tea and placed 2 mugs on the coffee table because our history didn't deserve a courtroom. When she came in, she looked smaller still. The light from the window cut across her face like an unkind spotlight. There was a long silence. I thought about saying, "I hoped you'd learn," but that was petty too. Instead, I asked her to sit. She sat and folded her hands as if praying. She said, "I don't know what to say." The words felt rehearsed. She looked at me with the same pleading, weary face she used to when she wanted something. She said, "I'm sorry." The apology was thinner than before. She said, "I didn't mean it to get like this." I could have listed the specifics then, the nights I'd spent alone, the ring that never fit in my pocket again, the ways my father had raged and my mother had cried. I could have demanded a dramatic confession. But words can be slippery, and I wanted something more substantial. I wanted to see that she had been changed, not by being caught, but by understanding. So I told her a story instead, one small story that mattered to me. I told her about a day, months after the breakup originally, when I'd been walking through the park and seen a woman pushing a stroller who looked tired and overworked. The woman and I made the same tired joke about how coffee was the only way to survive, and for a second I felt like maybe life could be normal again. But later that night, when I unpacked old dreams in the dark, I thought of the way love had been taken from me, not by death, but by betrayal, and how trust had become an impossible currency. I told her how being betrayed by 2 people who were supposed to love me made me question whether I could ever trust anyone again. She listened. Her mouth moved like the shadow of words. Then she said, quietly, "I know I hurt you." And I pressed on. "Do you know how it felt to go to bed and imagine a life you'd rehearsed 100 times and then have it stripped away because 2 people chose to lie? Do you know what it means when the person you trusted the most picks someone else over you and makes that choice without looking back?" Her eyes filled, genuinely, and for a moment I thought maybe I would have what I wanted. But then she said, "I'm sorry you felt that way." There it was. Distance. She placed the pain back on me as a feeling rather than as the consequence of her actions. It was an admission, but not an ownership. That almost undid me. I wanted to scream that remorse isn't sympathy and that apologies must be accompanied by responsibility. I wanted to tell her that the only acceptable form of repair was a lifetime of not repeating the harm. Instead, I sat and watched her try to explain the person she was and the person she wanted to be. She spoke about loneliness and poor choices and a desire to change for real this time. There was an honesty in her confession that made me ache for who she might have been. I wanted to accept that honesty, but I also wanted justice. So I made a demand that was small and precise. She had to make amends in a way that was visible and accountable. Not performative charity, not heartfelt Instagram captions, but actual restitution. She needed to return funds if she had taken them, to sign paperwork that clarified her role in the fundraiser, and to publicly acknowledge the mistakes in a format that wouldn't allow her to retreat into "I was misunderstood." It was both a practical step and an emotional one, public accountability that could not be undone by charm alone. She hesitated. Pride or fear? I couldn't tell. Then she said she would. It wasn't immediate, but she agreed. She would speak with the charity, with our family, and with anyone else
Affected. She would accept whatever consequences followed. My heart flipped at the idea of it. Maybe I had finally wrung some truth from her. Maybe I had created a path for her to actually grow. In the weeks that followed, she did some of these things. She signed forms to help with audits. She reached out to people who had been promised things and offered restitution plans. Some of it felt genuine.
some of it felt like damage control. I watched everything she did with a scientist's eye, cataloging sincerity and performance until the line between the two blurred. People started to say things like, maybe she's finally getting it. Others said, she only did that because she was cornered. Both statements could be true at once. And then the unexpected happened. My sister disappeared again, but this time, not into selfish indulgence, into treatment. It started with vague text about therapy. Then I got a call from a counselor asking whether I would be willing to participate in a family session. At first, I thought it was another manipulation, but their voice was earnest and the letterhead looked legitimate. I went to the counseling center with a knot in my stomach, convinced I would be facing down another ill-posed defense. Instead, what I found was a woman who had been peeling layers off herself, one stubborn, messy layer at a time. It wasn't cinematic. There were no miraculous revelations. There were small admissions repeated in different ways. Afternoons spent sitting in silence. A long string of appointments where she spoke and then didn't. And sessions where she finally began to connect the dots between the person she'd been and the person she wanted not to be. Watching that change was complicated. Some days I felt like it meant nothing. Other days I felt the tide shift imperceptibly. She was no longer the woman who'd waltzed back into our lives expecting absolution. She was a person doing the long, grinding work of relearning how to be responsible. It would be naive to say I forgave her in those months. Forgiveness is not a switch you flip. But something else happened. An unglamorous, durable thing. The space between us began to change. The sharp edges dulled. We were not sisters in the way we had been as kids, furious allies or intimate conspirers. But we were something else. Two people with shared blood and very different stories. I had gotten what I wanted. Accountability, exposure, restitution. I also got something I had not planned for. A complicated, slow return of human connection that felt, in its own awkward way, like a kind of peace. Would you have stopped once the first dominoes fell, or would you have chased them all the way down? I think the real question is who you want to be after the revenge is complete. Because revenge can teach you how to win arguments and dominate narratives, but it can also teach you how to be small in ways you didn't expect. It can cost you relationships, reputation, and sometimes your own sense of goodness. In this story, it cost me some nights of sleep and some easy answers. It also taught me about the complexity of justice, how it's never only punitive, and how sometimes it demands repair more than retribution. The fallout slowed. Her life, markedly altered, forced her into patterns of repetition, showing up to work sober, returning borrowed sums, attending meetings with the charity to make amends. The social circles that had once offered her a soft landing closed, and she had to learn to stand on bare ground. It's cruel in one sense, but it's also honest. People either grow or they learn to be smaller in the company of others. She chose the former, albeit imperfectly. And me? I found that standing at the center of this drama gave me a kind of access to hinge on. For the first time since the betrayal, I felt agency again. But with that agency came responsibility. I realized I had a choice every morning to keep the ledger open and add new grievances, or to close it and live with the knowledge that justice had been served as best I could manage. I chose the latter, not because I was magnanimous, but because I wanted to be able to sleep. So we rebuilt, both of us, in our small, scarred ways. Family dinners resumed with a new etiquette. Fewer assumptions, more slow questions. My sister and I never reclaimed the instant intimacy of our teenage years, but we developed an uneasy truce that sometimes tasted like forgiveness and sometimes like mutual exhaustion. I learned to accept that some things can be repaired only in increments, with paperwork, therapy receipts, and the slow accrual of reliability. There were people who still thought I had gone too far. They would pull me aside and say, "There are kinder ways." And I would not, because perhaps they were right. But I had been entrusted in a sense with the duty of protecting myself and my family from a repeat of harm. I used the tools I had: patience, documentation, and strategy. When I weighed the costs and benefits, I stayed with my choices. If you're sitting there thinking about this story and asking, would I have done the same? I can't answer for you. I can only say that for me, the revenge was more complex than I had imagined. It didn't feel like a movie finale. It felt like a long, necessary surgery. Painful, but intended to heal. It left scars, sure, but it also removed tumors of deceit that would have festered otherwise. In the end, my sister apologized publicly. She made amends as best she could, and she continued therapy. She never recovered her old social life, and in some ways that was fair. But she learned sobriety from charm and developed the muscle of accountability. I kept my distance when needed, but I also allowed small kindnesses. An extra casserole on a hard day, a quiet text when she had a bad session. That isn't forgiveness in the grand cinematic sense. It's a cautious truce, and it's enough. So what would you have done in my shoes? Be honest. Would you have waited this long for payback? Would you have engineered a fall like I did? People will judge you either way, for being cold or being gentle. But remember this. The thing about revenge is that it can give you back power. And with power comes the responsibility to decide what kind of person you want to be afterward. I wanted to be someone who wouldn't be played again. I also, unexpectedly, wanted to be someone who could look at my sister and know she had been forced, by exposure, by consequence, and by therapy, into a place where she might one day stop hurting people. If you reached the end of this with a feeling of satisfaction, good. If you felt a prick of guilt, good too. These are messy human things. There is no neat moral ledger that balances joy and sorrow perfectly. But I'll tell you what I know. When you're betrayed by those closest to you, silence is the easiest shelter, and revenge is the hardest medicine. Sometimes it tastes bitter, sometimes it tastes like vindication, and sometimes, if you're lucky, it tastes like the truth served plainly. Years later, sitting at a small family gathering after my father's full recovery, my sister passed me a dish she'd baked. Our hands touched for a heartbeat. We smiled at each other in a small, private way. It wasn't the roaring reconciliation in movies. It was quieter, a contained thing. Revenge had a cost, but so did silence. We had both paid something. I still wonder sometimes whether a different path might have spared us both. But then I look at the life I rebuilt, at the boundaries I now carry that keep me safe, and I know I did what I had to do.